Welcome to Week 7, where we look at the strategic logic of genocide through the lens of political science. Here's our list of objectives. We begin with the premise that genocide is almost always a political phenomenon, a strategy in larger power struggles and violent conflicts. To the extent that it's associated with any of these other forms of political violence, we're concerned with the conditions in which genocide becomes a preferable policy option. Empirically, genocide describes a form of extensive, large-scale, organized, systemic, sustained, and deliberate violence, in which victims are identified on the basis of their ostensible group membership and targeted for destruction. Although, what assumption is made here about the keyword destruction, particularly in terms of the anthropoemic-anthropophagic distinction? What distinguishes genocide as a policy option? What other assumptions are being made when Strauss calls for exploring negative cases of genocide? What do you make of his claim that genocide is rare? Compare this claim to the genocide continuum concept that we saw a few weeks back. Which do you favor, Strauss's sharper approach or Schepper-Hughes's conceptual elasticity? Let's turn to Strauss's theoretical argument, which is situated between two different ways of looking at the politics of genocide. On the one hand is the strategic approach. Like war, genocide is a high-risk strategy, a means to an end. But why choose genocide over other strategic options? This opens up the ideological explanation. A useful analogy here is the functionalist-intentionalist debate in Holocaust historiography. Reading one synthesizes these two perspectives. It accounts for the general observation that genocide is rarely the initial intent of the perpetrators, that it typically emerges as a kind of Plan C, a last resort after repeated failures to quote-unquote solve the problem. This theory also accounts for how such quote-unquote problems are defined in the first place. In particular, how the targeted group is marked by the perpetrators as a strategic threat. So, under what conditions does genocide become a preferable policy option? It tends to be the case once the perpetrators see their targets as being not just uncooperative, uncontainable, and uncontrollable, but, more importantly, as a dangerous, imminent, existential threat. Reading one also refines our vocabulary for explaining genocide as a process. Why does Strauss focus on escalation and restraint? What factors either speed up or slow down the process? Elsewhere, Strauss emphasizes the difference between long-term risk factors for genocide and their immediate causes, or triggers. Consider this analogy. High temperatures and wind speeds, low humidity, dry vegetation. These are the prime conditions for a forest fire. It only takes a random campfire, cigarette butt, or a lightning strike to set it off. Likewise, the politics of genocide decenters our focus on intent and instead looks at genocide as a contingent outcome. In this sense, why does Strauss emphasize the dynamics between the core leadership of the state and local level actors on the ground? How is this dynamic the source of escalation and restraint? Strauss's argument fits into something we've seen before, with Mark Levine's perpetrator-victim paradox, whereby the actual power differential is obscured by the social psychological projections by the perpetrators of the victims as threats. Strauss refers to this as the domination vulnerability paradox on page 56 of Reading 1. Both he and Levine are essentially talking about the same thing here. This literature dates back to Norman Cohn, a British historian whose original interest was with medieval heretics, which he used to frame his analysis of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. These are the conditions that produce the logic of genocide, in which an ostensibly defensive strategy of self-preservation is filtered through an offensive psychosocial framework. This idea is central to our next three readings, which provide case studies of this dynamic. We see this in Reading 2, which begins with an exercise in comparative genocide studies, where the author distinguishes between so-called settler genocides, such as the 1904 case in German Southwest Africa, from native genocides, such as the 1994 case of Rwanda. We're concerned with the latter case, where the strategic logic of genocide was born out of a bitter post-colonial struggle. Mamdani's argument builds on the seminal post-colonial theory of Frantz Fanon, who was concerned with the psychopathology of colonialism. Because colonialism is inherently violent and dehumanizing against the colonized, Fanon showed how liberation is obtained as a revolutionary form of counter-violence, thereby legitimizing violence against the settler. In the Rwandan case, this dynamic stemmed from the colonial era, when the so-called Hamitic hypothesis was used to legitimize a system in which European colonial rule was administered by a Tutsi minority over a Hutu majority. This racialized distinction only hardened once Rwanda became independent. By 1994, the dominant Hutu power movement were self-cast as the aggrieved natives, whereas the Tutsi were targeted as offensive settlers. Compare Mamdani to Friedlander in Reading 3, who shows how medieval-era conspiracies against Jews foreshadowed modern conspiracies. For example, Jews were targeted as agents of modernity, responsible for the loss of tradition. This laid the groundwork for the stab-in-the-back myth about Jewish subterfuge during the war, which was only further radicalized by the specter of communism. Nazism offered a promise of redemption, with Hitler cast as the self-styled hero in the apocalyptic struggle between Aryans and Jews. How does this image compare to the Hutu power ideologues who saw the Tutsi as threatening others? Was Nazism a national liberation movement? Dirk Moses in Reading 4 combines Friedlander's redemptive antisemitism with Fanon's post-colonial theory of violence and national liberation. He does this in order to supplement Friedlander, who does a good job stressing the ideological side, but fails to account for the strategic, pragmatic side. Again, think of Strauss's argument, which combines ideology and strategy. This piece also makes the case that the Nazis were influenced by the political imaginaries during what he sees as the racial century, when paradigmatic assumptions behind European colonialism infused Western politics writ large. Thus, Moses concludes that the Nazis were essentially waging a war of post-colonial national liberation. According to this imaginary framework, many Germans regarded themselves as an indigenous people who were being slowly colonized by foreigners, namely Jews. What do you make of this controversial argument? Okay, and that's it. We have our usual weekly assignments, and you have your historiographical essay coming up. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.